Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi. I'm the treasurer for Columbia Club of Washington, D.C., and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. We are very privileged to have Professor Lilie Chouliaraki, Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science, to talk about the weaponization of victimhood. This is the title of a professor's most recent book, published by Columbia University Press. You can go to our website to find a link to that book. We also send an email with a link to that book with a discount code. We will do that again with the recording of this session. And you also can go to our website for professor's full bio. But please allow me to briefly introduce her. Professor Chouliaraki focuses on ethical and political complexities of communicating human suffering, focusing on four particular domains, which is disaster news, humanitarian and human rights advocacy, war and conflict reporting, and migration news. Among her publications are The Spectatorship of Suffering, published in 2006, and The Ironic Spectator, Solidarity in the Age of Post-Humanitarianism, published in 2013, for which she has won the Outstanding Book of the Year award from the International Communication Association 2015. Also, I want to mention that she is the recipient of 2 LSE Teaching Excellence Awards and 5 international awards. So without further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kambiz, for this introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be part of this event and conversation with the Columbia University alumni at Washington, D.C. Quite a distinguished and interesting group of people, even if from a distance. And in introducing some ideas from my new book, Wronged, the Weaponization of Victimhood, I hope that my talk can contribute to our collective conversations as citizens primarily, but also for those of us who are scholars, as academics, to think through the challenges of our world, particularly one of the most worrying developments in our politics and culture, the rise of the far right violence in the name of the oppressed and of the victims. So let me start straight away with a quote. "There can be nothing higher or more critical than the defense of innocent unborn life." This is what the US State Representative Jim Olson, a Republican, said on May 19th, 2022, speaking of the bill to ban abortions in the state of Oklahoma. Now, this was a mere 5 weeks before the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the US Supreme Court, rendering the right to abortion conditional on the federal politics of states. Now, this idea of the fetus as innocent unborn life lies at the heart of the far-right rationale for this overturning. And the idea of protecting this life is framed in the far-right rhetoric in the legal language of human rights. It's a right to life, or to potential life, as the Supreme Court called it. Now, there are 2 things I want to point out here. Firstly, the idea of the unborn fetus, the unborn entity, as a person with human rights, whose life is under threat and needs legal protection. That rhetoric casts the fetus as a potential sufferer. And secondly, this same rhetoric turns those who decide to have an abortion into perpetrators. And here comes my first slide, a picture from protests, where by depriving the fetus of their right to exist, those people are seen to commit violence and, in fact, nothing less than murder. Now, these 2 points, the casting of the fetus as a sufferer entitled to the right to life, and the portrayal of those having an abortion as perpetrators, are 2 key constituents of the vocabulary of victimhood that I discuss in my talk today. And specifically, and here comes the slide with the outline of my talk, I begin with kind of offering an exploration of the concept of victimhood itself. And I use the pro-life or anti-abortion argument to break down the concept and propose, if you like, a best way to understand it. And specifically, what I would like us to understand is what it is about victimhood that makes it such a powerfyou linguistic weapon in our culture and politics. And by our, I mean just broadly Western politics and culture in largely the Anglo-American world. Not that these phenomena do not exist elsewhere, notably in the global South, but my own focus has been really on the British and American realities. After a kind of an attempt to understand the concept of victimhood a little bit better, I then zoom into a admittedly brief analysis or description, rather, of how Trump weaponized victimhood at the service of his far-right agenda during the lethal first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in ways that ultimately harmed the most vulnerable. And finally, I ask how we can question victimhood, challenge our uses of the vocabulary of victimhood as it is currently weaponized by the far right, and how we can challenge and reclaim that vocabulary at the service of those who are most exposed to violence, those who are most vulnerable in society. So there comes another slide with my definition of victimhood in the book, Wronged, where I simply say that victimhood refers to claims to suffering that accrue moral status to the claimant and attach responsibility for the infliction or relief of suffering to other actors. So victimhood, basically, beyond the victim, always includes the benefactor, relief of suffering, and the perpetrator, right? The infliction of suffering. And we have just seen how rights, and particularly the right to life, has been used as a claim to suffering that evokes a victim, the fetus as potential life in need of protection, a perpetrator, a women who have abortions and states that allow them, and a benefactor, pro-life activists, Republican politicians, perhaps above all the Supreme Court that voted for the right to life of a fetus. But it is not just rights that is used as a vocabulary of victimhood. It is also trauma. Another Republican argument is indeed that women who have abortions can suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So unlike rights, which is a claim to social suffering or injury, a lack of rights or a lack of legal protection from harm, trauma is about psychological suffering inflicted upon us by violent or tragic events, relationships, or people. Now, in the language of rights and trauma, and that's interesting with respect to the choreography of victimhood I just described with respect to rights. The actors of victimhood now move around. Women are not perpetrators now, they are victims, with a perpetrator being abortion clinics that are criminalized and the feminist activists and political forces that defend abortion. As before, the benefactors are pro-life activists, politicians from, Republican politicians who care for women and who don't want them to suffer emotionally. Now, in the book, I approach both rights and trauma as 2 exemplary paradigmatic languages of pain in our public spheres, or if you like, in our public conversations today. And I spent some time tracing their emergence back to the legacy of the environment, particularly the French and the Scottish environment, even though, in fact, they took their current form as trauma and rights in the late 19th and early 20th century Western thought, in Freud, obviously psychoanalysis, trauma, and in liberal thought and Marxian and post-Marxian political thought. The language of human rights has a more complex genealogy, if you like. Now, even though I can hardly go through the kind of complex history of these legacies here, in the course of the 20th century, and that is what really matters, as many have argued, beyond me, these two languages came to dominate public discourse, public life, and have now become indispensable in our everyday communication and institutional communication, workplace, education, politics, the media, intimate relations, deeply entrenching our ways of speaking, thinking, and feeling about ourselves and about our political and social and personal relations. Now, this new emotional culture of our times, a culture that places so much emphasis on the individual as a suffering self, has, as I've just said, been discussed and analyzed by many, across the social sciences, really, sociologists, psychologists, political theorists, et cetera. So we have those who speak about, emotional capitalism, Eva Illouz, for instance, therapy culture, the empire of trauma, great book by Didier Fassin and Elke Rechtman, trauma culture, the governmentality of the soul, et cetera. So there's a whole kind of vocabulary that tries to explain how the rise of those two languages have become so prominent in our cultures. Now, my own contribution builds on these other accounts, but also goes beyond them, in that it expands our understanding of the concept of victimhood in three ways. And bear with me as I kind of outline those, and in order to kind of complete and kind of offer you a kind of fuller idea of how we might better understand victimhood. So firstly, I've just argued, the culture of the victim, or victimhood culture today, is not only about therapy, right? It's not only about the language of trauma, but also about civil culture and the language of rights. And, the example I just used exemplifies this. So here comes my first slide, where we talk about understanding victimhood as a whole vocabulary of pain, not just as trauma or just as rights, but as kind of a whole vocabulary that includes both. So if trauma is grounded on the therapeutic conversation, on empathetic dialogue and the emotional healing of the psyche, rights has historically been the language of mass social movements, of collective protest against the injuries, for instance, of the working class, in the French Revolution, also in classical, Marxist, post-Marxist, left-wing progressive thought, of women, of Black people, colonial subjugation, et cetera. So rights has historically emerged as the language of the oppressed and the marginalized. But also most recently, and by saying most recently, I mean post-World War II and its tremendous atrocities, notably the Holocaust, rights has been the language of global governance as well, the UN, the International Court of Justice, et cetera, where human rights works as, or is supposed to work as, legal protection from various forms of violence at the service of the most vulnerable individuals and groups in the world. What these histories explain is that the languages of pain, trauma, and rights have come from particular trajectories that involve people and their suffering throughout history. And they also explain how those languages have gradually, through the past century, come to be so deeply entrenched in our collective conversations, right? How they have shaped us as a moment of emotional capitalism or empire of trauma, et cetera, et cetera. Today, however, trauma and rights don't belong to any particular social group or any particular political community. They circulate in free-floating ways as we speak to one another in public and in private. And they turn our public cultures into a terrain of contestation, into a site of struggle. And there comes my next slide, where claims to psychological suffering, I am traumatized, and claims to social suffering, I have been wronged, I'm injured, coexist, compete, clash, and mix with one another. They are used, in other words, as linguistic weapons by different social actors in their attempts to gain the moral and political recognition that historically goes with the status of the victim in our societies. And just like we saw in the pro-life example, these languages of pain bring together a shifting choreography of sufferers, perpetrators, and benefactors who struggle for attention, for visibility, for recognition, and domination. In other words, they struggle over who is a victim to be empathized with, who needs to be punished or castigated as a perpetrator, and who is to be applauded or rewarded as a benefactor. Think back to the work that victimhood does in the pro-life rhetoric. By placing suffering and pain at the heart of its argument, and by attaching the language of rights to its category of unborn life, this rhetoric manages to conjure up a worthy victim, the fetus, and in this way, to turn a deeply misogynistic narrative of the evangelical far right, that abortion should not be allowed, no matter the women's circumstances, into a benevolent moral case. We need to protect innocent unborn babies and punish their murderers. Simultaneously, this narrative also places women in the ambivalent position of being both the perpetrator, right, murderers, castigate them on their decisions on abortion, and the victim, for warning them of the risks of PTSD and wanting to protect them from the trauma of abortion. So women in this rhetoric are there to police and control, but also to patronize and save from themselves. We could say that the overturning of Roe versus Wade relied precisely on this reversal of victimhood that attaches blame and guilt on women and praise to those backrolling one of the most important legal victories for women in the 20th century. And this reversal, this capacity of victimhood to twist and turn attachments to pain and to organize its actors in different relationships of blame and praise, takes me to the second contribution that I am making to debates on the role of the victim in politics and culture. So that here we have a slide, understanding victimhood as a form of politics, namely, that when we speak of victimhood, we do not refer to a static term that ascribes a fixed identity to a person, an identity that is essential to me or any self. Rather, victimhood is a whole politics of communicating pain, right? It's a politics of communication. It's part, in other words, of what campaigners might call strategic communication, but it involves pain at the heart of it. In this, what I call in the book, the politics of pain, claims to trauma and injury, emotional and social suffering, together with the victim, the good doer, the evil doer, all these roles that suffering kind of assigns to the actors that it brings together. These claims, therefore, to trauma and injury and their actors seek to engage us in tactical relationships of blame and praise with the aim to bring together certain communities of recognition and belonging. Us. We belong to this community because we recognize that pain, and we accuse the others, those we exclude from that community, them, from our community of pain. They are the perpetrators, we are the victims, and here are our benefactors. Whoever comes to empathize, rescue us, or comfort us and gives us the recognition that we deserve as a community. Now, how does this politics of pain work? And I claim that politics of pain, the politics of communicating pain, works precisely through this, if you like, shape-shifting capacity of victimhood to choreograph itself into different narratives of blame and praise. And here I have a second slide on my example of victimhood as a politics of pain, where we saw, for instance, in the pro-life example, that victimhood has the capacity to produce competing but simultaneous attachments within the same category of the self, of identity. Women can be perpetrators, in other words, of the ultimate injury, you know, of taking a life, murderers in the abortion, but at the same time, they are also victims of the trauma of abortion, right? So we have competing but simultaneous attachments within the same category of identity, women. And by this token, victimhood can also be claimed by anyone and everyone. It can be claimed by perpetrators who can also be victims. It can even be claimed in the name of those who do not exist as persons. And let's remember that the fetus did not acquire personhood until the June 2022 Supreme Court decision. So victimhood can be claimed in the name of those who don't exist. And by that token, again, it can also be attached to non-persons. In the same way that it can be attached to non-persons, victimhood can also be denied to real persons. Women are not recognized as victims of the law and its misogyny. So we can see what I mean by the shape-shifting capacity of victimhood, you know, that it can hold two things at once, exclude some, include others, be attached to non-persons and denied to real persons. And here comes my third and final contribution to the workings of the cultural politics of victimhood in our, in our public life. With victimhood, and I think we all probably can understand that now, it doesn't really matter whether someone is vulnerable or not. It does not matter which position of structural vulnerability one objectively occupies in social space. And by objectively here, I refer to historical evidence, but also current scientific indicators, qualitative and quantitative, that show us which social groups are more open to structures of violence. Poverty could be one, misogyny, racism, homophobia, and other forms of deprivation, discrimination, abuse, or even death. And hence, which categories or groups or people are more likely to be systematically victimized. Instead, what matters in victimhood is power. What forms of power do those who claim victimhood hold? Where do they stand in pre-existing social hierarchies? What kinds of capital do they own? Economic, symbolic, cultural, military? What kinds of access, credibility, and authority do these forms of capital grant them? And what do these forms of capital protect the claimants of victimhood from? But also, what kinds of violence are those without certain forms of capital exposed to? And here comes my next very crucial slide, actually, the slide where I juxtapose vulnerability to victimhood. And here what I want to say is that while such questions, the questions I just posed, cannot really adjudicate individual cases of victimhood, we cannot really know for sure what kind, often complex and intersecting forms of pain individual people carry, right? We can't know their emotional pain, and some forms of, vulnerability are invisible. Nonetheless, I think it is worth asking them because they help us grasp victimhood in terms of two different dimensions of the politics of communicating pain, the kind of power struggles around who is a victim. So these questions can help us separate claimed victimhood, victimhood in its linguistic form as a speech act, something I just kind of put out there in a collective conversation, in the public sphere, in public, discourse, if you like. I am traumatized, or I've been wronged. On the one hand, claimed victimhood, the language I use, and on the other hand, systemic vulnerability or structural vulnerability, which refers precisely to those contexts of relative exposure to violence, or relative sheltering from violence in its various forms that different groups or people might be positioned in, right? And here I talk about kind of classic sociodemographic categories, like, for instance, what class, what race, what gender, what sexuality, what kind of ability-based criteria are there to see which groups and individuals are more or less systemically open to certain forms of violence over others, or systemically privileged in terms of their sheltering from such violence. So back to our pro-life example, claims to women as perpetrators and not as victims occur despite the bulk of medical and social scientific research, what I call, quote unquote, objective knowledge and official statistics, showing the multiple systemic harms inflicted upon women being denied the option on abortion. And a recent article by a distinguished professor at Berkeley called Frank Worrell, and I have a screenshot of the kind of key findings of the article actually in the next slide, provides a comprehensive overview of relevant facts. People denied abortion suffer both from more mental health issues, anxiety, stress, low self-esteem, etc. So what we might call, more psychological suffering, traumas, basically, and from increased social suffering, economic hardships, and, higher poverty rates, etc. So both trauma and injury. And among all these categories, Black women in particular run the highest risk of illegal abortion-related deaths, with 3 times greater than that of white women. So that's all in terms of my understanding of victimhood and how I think we should start approaching that concept to understand it better. And the next slide is a kind of a visual diagram of my of that part of my talk. And I'm just going to also kind of just verbalize it now for you. So what I have argued so far is that victimhood is not just a single word in our daily language use. It is a vocabulary. It is a vocabulary that consists of 2 languages of pain, trauma and injury, psychological and social suffering. Both languages stem from the status of human suffering in Enlightenment thought, as I argued, through as a catalyst of, morality in our societies, right? Moral education, we become better people by getting in touch with our inner suffering and with the suffering of others around us. Political action, suffering mobilizes, as I said, political contestation and struggles for social change, and civil culture, right? We become more empathetic in our intimate life, in our personal relations, in our workplace relations, in our relations, social and political relations at large. I also argued that the kind of historical legacies of those languages being grounded in the Enlightenment, today both languages are free-floating terms that are constantly implicated in struggles over power. They are routinely used in our everyday conversations to conjure up a whole choreography of actors, victims, perpetrators, benefactors in narratives of victimhood that are employed to the benefit of those who claim it. And what is the benefit? Recognition and domination in the public sphere. And it is precisely that routine and tactical use of the languages of pain in struggles over power that renders the communication of victimhood a certain kind of politics, a politics of pain. And finally, as a form of politics, victimhood does not necessarily speak to people's vulnerability, to the conditions of vulnerability that people may inhabit or not. It speaks primarily to the will to power. By this, I simply mean that those who successfully appropriate the languages of pain are not necessarily those who are most open to violence, but those who already have the social and economic power, the social and economic capital to be heard and recognized as victims. And that's really important when we come to kind of coming to grips with and having to deal with a far-right victimhood. So now with these points in mind, in the next and rather brief part of my talk, no other part of the talk, the other next subsequent two are as long as the first one. Let me just shift gear and probe a bit deeper into far-right communication as a politics of pain. And in order to do that, I'm kind of moving also from the example of, the pro-life rhetoric to death-related rhetoric. And because I really want to reflect on the far-right populism of Donald Trump during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, which in the book I treat as the peak moment of mass suffering, global mass suffering in the 21st century. And the United States, as much as the United Kingdom, which is also part of my case study in the book, suffered greatly, particularly in that first wave. And I apologize in advance if this topic is difficult or triggering for anyone, but I believe we need to kind of address those questions head on, because they do reveal the cruelty that lies at the very heart of far-right victimhood. Now, the idea that far-right populists use victimhood is not new, as in it's there everywhere, in our news, in our public conversations, in academia. There's a whole body of literature that speaks about how populist leaders address the people as victims and themselves as the charismatic saviors of people's of the people from their suffering. I mean, in the UK we had Brexit and the European elites, European Union, here the migrants, the media, the political elites, etc., etc. But my attention turns into the first wave of the pandemic in the United States in particular, because this country suffered a horrific death toll simply from March 2020 through to June 2020, particularly this part of the country where I am now in New York, where 125,000 Americans, or the 28% of worldwide deaths, occurred here. And this topping of the global death rankings at that time poses a paradox for populists like Trump, because how come that charismatic redeemer, that savior of people's lives, turned into the people's own perpetrator? And of course, it's all about their lies and their manipulation of the language. Yeah, but how exactly did that manipulation take place? So I think we need to go beyond the he was lying and kind of look at a range of strategies of communication that were used at the time to kind of manage that paradox of victimhood. And the next slide kind of enumerates those strategies. I call them denial in the early stages of the pandemic, the muting of grief, and reverse victimization. So denial. And the next slide again is kind of visualizing that strategy. So after the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared COVID-19 a global pandemic, and while the rest of the world was swiftly going into lockdown in March 2020, Donald Trump made a point of taking selfies with people, doing handshakes, and appearing on television to emphasize that it is still safe to continue with life as normal. That same thing with Boris Johnson in the UK as well. The politics of pain employed here then entails what? It entails a denial of sickness and death in that the idea that COVID-19 was a deadly virus was dismissed. It's just the flu, right? And the aim was to keep the economy going. And in fact, it was lockdowns that Trump considered as a form of suffering. For instance, he opposed early CDC recommendations by using the language of trauma. He said, people get tremendous anxiety and depression, and there are a lot more suicides, more deaths than the virus, meaning if we start taking public health measures like lockdowns. Yeah, research in Columbia University has already shown that denial cost lives. At least 36,000 people would have been saved had the lockdowns been announced just a week earlier. The second strategy is the muting of grief. This strategy refers to the systematic absence of empathy in Trump's communication. In his media appearances, press conferences, tweets, etc., there was really no acknowledgement of the loss of life that was taking place at the time, nor did he extend his compassion to the families of victims. And my next slide includes a couple of quotes that I think are just indicative of his rhetoric on COVID deaths in the first wave. Where he, on May 5th, 2020, he was quoted in The Hill as saying, you can never really come close to replacing when you've lost someone, no matter how well we do next year. I think our economy is going to be raging, is going to be so good, no matter how well those people can never, ever replace somebody they love. And here we see how you can't really formulate a sincere and deeply felt empathetic message without really bringing in a kind of economic thinking of the economy raging, etc., etc. And then our death tolls, our numbers per million are really very, very strong. He told reporters on Thursday, that's New York Times, April 30th, 2020. We're very proud of the job that we have done. So coupled then with this radical withdrawal or withholding of compassion, Trump's politics of pain also involved something we've already seen in the pro-life example, reverse victimization. And here comes the slide from his tweet, Liberate, right? In April 2020, Trump made a call to insurrection against federal lockdowns when he tweeted Liberate Michigan, Minnesota, Virginia, to his 77 million followers. Now, liberate is an interesting word because it draws directly on the language of rights. This is a libertarian interpretation of rights as the freedom of, our freedom as individuals to just do whatever we like, following our own desires, irrespectively of the impact that those actions may have on other people around us, independently, in other words, of any idea of a common good or public protection, right, from a deadly virus. So his tweets were kind of a call to freedom, to resistance to the oppression of public health measures, and a claiming of the right to the oppressed to move freely as they liked in the midst of mass infections. And I kind of claim in the book that this is reverse victimhood, much along the lines of the pro-life argument. Now, instead of the fetus, it is now Trump's far-right supporters whose inconvenience for having to wear masks or go to into temporary lockdowns was cast as social injury that needed to be resisted or fought against. And similarly, instead of women whose own systemic vulnerability was ignored in the pro-life argument, it is now a broader constituency of socially and clinically vulnerable groups that was silenced. And here, I think there is a slide next to this. Here is a constituency of vulnerable groups as described by the OECD in its 2020 COVID-19 report. The young, the low-educated, migrants, racial ethnic minorities, and low-wage workers were overrepresented in jobs that cannot be done remotely and were therefore exposed to a higher risk of infection and job loss when the pandemic began, right? And many of those employed in these at-risk jobs continue to work in physical contact with other people throughout the pandemic to deliver essential goods and services. Now, it was among those people, particularly, again, kind of Black and Latino communities, that the highest percentages of infection and death were recorded. And it is in this sense that victimhood operates as a will to power, as a linguistic weapon of the far right that promises to rule in the name of those who suffer, only to then promote what we can call like a death politics that hits hardest those who are most open to violence in the first place. Now, in concluding, where can we go from here? In a world where we witness the rise and rise of the far right and where much systemic, structural pain remains invisible, what vocabulary is there to use to reflect and politicize that pain? My answer is that there is no other vocabulary to turn to when we are talking about the predicament of human suffering. Of course, and I think here it's quite interesting that the Democrats are now, in contradistinction to the language of pain, are coming up with a vocabulary of joy. And I haven't thought that through quite as yet, but I find the kind of the contradistinction between the two of them quite fascinating in terms of political communication. Just to go back to the predicament of human suffering that so many of those around us in our own societies and beyond live in. As I argued, I think there is no other vocabulary to turn to. Trauma and rights are handed down to us in the long history of modernity, Western modernity, grappling with emotional and social forms of violence our societies inflicted on others as much as onto ourselves. From the colonial conquest and dispossession of the global South to the mass destruction of the world wars in the European continent and around the world throughout the 20th century. This is where those languages are grounded and where they were galvanized into their contemporary uses. So the task today, I believe, and one of the key political stakes of our times is to appropriate these languages anew and use them to join the struggles and highlight the causes of those whose pain remains unrecognized in our societies and around the world, to render dominant, if you like, a different politics of pain, a politics that will also enable us to listen to and engage with claims to suffering that usually go under the radar of public discourse. Now, there are a number of proposals that I make in the book regarding this, but I think it is worth kind of closing off this presentation by by singling out one, which I think is the most important. And this is that we need to start thinking about victimhood as a politics of communication, a politics of communicating pain. And we need to start thinking about the power relations that are at the heart of that communication. And this means that we need to, every time we're confronted with a claim to victimhood, we need to ask the uncomfortable question, why is this claim to pain worthy of my response? In other words, we need to become, I think, more suspicious of victimhood as a vocabulary in our public language, in our public conversations, and learn to approach claims to pain, not just as appeals to emotion, but as I said it, I'm saying it for multiple times, as a will to power, not as a plea to respond to immediately, but as a claim to be scrutinized. And here is a preliminary inventory of questions, and that's my penultimate slide, that we may begin asking every time we are confronted with a claim to pain. So, who claims pain, for whom, in which capacity, and from which social position of relative power, right? Who is the victim and who is the perpetrator in this? Which truth claims does this statement, vocabulary of pain articulate? Which context is it made in? What kinds of emotions come with it? What kinds of communities does it bring together, and what kinds of exclusions are important, does it presuppose and perpetuate? Who is silenced through those claims? And what are the implications of these exclusions for those who are already vulnerable in our societies? Finally, what tangible protection can we give the vulnerable? How can we keep others like them safe? And a final kind of thought before I end. It is not, and my ambition is not, that these questions will, clarify the terrain, the very complex and muddled terrain of the communication of victimhood once and for all. Right? We cannot, as I've already said, adjudicate on individual cases. You are a victim, or you say you're a victim, but you are not. Because we simply cannot really know, nor can we deny anyone's claim to feeling traumatized or feeling injured. And in the book, I make the argument that it would be immoral and unfair to do so, even to people at the top of the hierarchy of privilege, right? But what these questions can help us navigate is clear out some of the complex territory in which victimhood kind of plays its kind of communication game. Because it helps us navigate the space between what I earlier called systemic or structural vulnerability and tactical victimhood, claimed victimhood. The space where we can see who is relatively more exposed and who is more sheltered to which forms of violence, right? And they can help us make our judgment on where we stand with respect to each claim that we are confronted with based on the conditions of the suffering, rather than, for instance, prior habitual attachments. I'm with that side no matter what, or the force of authority. Those people, with expertise said it, so it must be true. Or the virality, the social media virality that kind of takes us with it, and we tweet, we share, we like, and the online popularity of an emotional appeal. And now, more than ever, particularly in view of the upcoming elections here in the US, but also in view of the rise of the far right in Europe, you saw, well, probably already what happened with, crucial regions of Germany in the recent elections and the rise of the AfD. It is important in this moment, I think, to navigate, our public conversations with clarity about what victimhood is and how it works, and use its politics of pain to highlight the suffering of those who endure the most, turning their often invisible or unrecognized pain into cause for social change. Because without this work of reclaiming vulnerability for a less violent and a more just world, the tactical uses of victimhood, and here I'm paraphrasing Hannah Arendt, can and will continue to change the world. Victimhood and claims to pain, struggles over suffering can change and have changed the world. But the most probable change will be to a world with more, not less suffering. Thank you very much for listening to me.